Hello, friends. This is Wikander, your friendly neighborhood Ugaritologist and biblical scholar, coming to you with yet another episode of banal yet awesome stuff you can learn from biblical studies and comparative Semitics. In this episode, we will not only be doing banal stuff, part of it will be relatively banal if you're into biblical studies and comparative linguistics, and parts of it will not. Hopefully, all will be awesome in one way or another. What I'll be talking about today is the Hebrew verbal system, the classical Hebrew verbal system, and especially one of its most wonderful and weird parts, the so-called consecutive imperfect, which is at the same time one of the most ancient and archaic and most innovative parts of the biblical Hebrew, classical Hebrew linguistic system. Biblical Hebrew has basically two main verbal forms. One of them is called perfect. It has other names too, but it's common to call it perfect. And that verbal form expresses, amongst other things, certain statements about the past, completed actions, and a number of other things, which we don't need to go into here. And the other one, called the imperfect, expresses, amongst other things, possibilities, futurality, modality, that is, things that might happen or should happen or may happen, and repeated actions, mostly in the future and sometimes in the present, and in a certain number of cases, actually in the past. So you have these two forms, the perfect and the imperfect, and the exact meanings of those two forms in classical Hebrew is the object of vociferous debate and has been so for many, many years. But in addition to that, and in addition to, participles and infinitives and all that kind of cool stuff, there are also two very weird forms known as consecutives, or sometimes using somewhat more archaic terminology, they're known as conversives. I'm not a great fan of those terms, so I'll call them consecutives here. And those two forms, commonly known as the imperfect consecutive and the perfect consecutive, look from a synchronic point of view as though they were somehow inverted in relation to the perfect and imperfect. They're made up of different variants of the conjunction wa or wa, meaning and what looks like an imperfect or a perfect form. But the difference is that the meaning seems somehow to be inverted. The imperfect consecutive is used for narration, perfectives, that is, single complete occurrences, mostly in past time, and especially narrational past. And it came to pass that, and then it happened that. The imperfect consecutive is in many ways the bread and butter form of Old Testament or Hebrew Bible narrative. And this looks very much like the opposite of what the normal imperfect means. The normal imperfect, as you may remember, has to do with futurality and ongoingness and possibility, which is very much not the same as narrativity and complete action in the past and consecutive action, that is narration that goes from A to B to C. So it looks as though it's been inverted, and something similar looks as though it's going on in the perfect consecutive. And note that I say looks as though. It's not actually what is going on from a historical perspective, but the perfect consecutive normally refers to the future or to repeated action, which looks as though this word and, the wa or wa, is inverting the meanings of the quote unquote tens forms. I say quote unquote since not all scholars are convinced that these are really tens forms. I'm personally one of the ones who don't really like the term tens for these classical Hebrew forms, but let's use it since there isn't any other good term to use. But from a historical point of view, inversion is not what's going on here. It's not the fact that the imperfect consecutive has become a perfect when you put an and in front of it. And it's not the fact that the perfect consecutive has become an imperfect when you put an and in front of it. What's going on is very different. Today, let's just talk about the imperfect consecutive. The perfect consecutive could be an issue for another day. What's actually going on from a historical perspective, and this has been known in Semitics for a long time, is that in earlier Northwest Semitic, the subgroup of Semitic languages to which Hebrew belongs, there were two forms underlying what looks a bit like the imperfect. the prefix conjugation. It's also called prefix conjugation because the imperfect is formed using prefixes. Like if you have the famous paradigm root qatal, which means to kill, the imperfect is yaqtul in the third person masculine singular, qal being the basic stem of the verb, yaqtul showing a prefix. That's why it's called a prefix form. But in earlier Northwest Semitic, there were actually two of these, a short one and a long one. And the long one, which was at that point yaqtulu, was used for basically what the imperfect is used for in Biblical Hebrew. It was used for ongoing stuff, repeated stuff, possible stuff, futural stuff, that kind of thing. Whereas the shorter one, which was yaqtul, meant one of two things. Either it was a jussive, meaning may he kill, or it was a perfective narrative. He killed, just stating the fact that he killed. In many Semitic languages, this shorter yaqtul form, this shorter prefix conjugation form, fell out of use during the first millennium BCE due to the fact that the perfect was gaining ground. The perfect was used for statements about the past, secure statements about the past. It was originally probably a stative form, that is a form expressing a state arrived at, and that form kind of encroached on the areas of competence of the short yaqtul, which was the perfective, the narrative, and then it happened kind of form. So the perfect and the short yaqtul, they competed with each other, and in many West Semitic languages, the short yaqtul sort of died, basically. But classical Hebrew kept it, but normally just in one specific context, and that is when it was preceded by the word and, wa. So you've got yaqtul, which means and he killed. And this having happened is not strange at all. Well, it's cool, but it's not strange because this form, the short yaqtul, was apparently coded for a specific use, namely consecutive narration, and then this happened, and then that happened, and those sort of narrations often tended to have the word and, wa, in front of them. And as the short yaqtul died out more and more, most of the forms of the short yaqtul actually became identical with a long yaqtulu form during the history of Hebrew due to short final vowels dropping out. So in most cases, they became identical, which also contributed to the demise of the short yaqtul narrative. But after wa, it was kept. And in so doing, the Hebrew language basically created a new verbal form, the yaqtul, the consecutive imperfect, the narrative form, which is both extremely archaic in the sense that it preserves the old Proto-Northwest Semitic short yaqtul form, which was dying out or getting identified with a long yaqtulu form. So it kept that. So it's very archaic in that sense, but it's also innovative in the sense that the and became regarded as part of the verb itself. It became grammaticalized, as the term has it. This word and became fused with the form of the word, and it became more or less obligatory. There are a couple of cases in the Hebrew Bible in which you find short yaqtuls without wa, but it's very rare. So basically, the wa acted as a sort of deep freezer. It preserved this dying verbal form, but it preserved it only when the wa was present in most cases. And that led to certain specifications of the form, since it starts with the wa, the and, it can only occur at the beginning of the clause. It can only stand at the absolute beginning of the clause, which also means that it can't be negated. You can't put a not in a sentence with the imperfect consecutive. The most common Hebrew word for not is lo, and it normally stands in front of the verb it negates. And since the yaqtul, the imperfect consecutive, has to stand at the beginning of the sentence, you can't negate it. So the yaqtul, even though it is the bread and butter form of classical Hebrew narration, it's also very circumscribed. You can only use it at the beginning of a clause and you cannot negate it. But on the other hand, it works very well. Wa this, wa that, wa this, wa that. The use of this form is the reason for older biblical translations having so many sentences that start with and especially the word and it came to pass, which is a translation of waihi, which is an imperfect consecutive. starting typically enough with wa. And if you know a little bit of Hebrew, you'll notice that waihi is based not on the long imperfect of the verb to be, which is yihyeh, but on the jussive, yehi, which is because it goes back to the short yaqtul form. Okay, so in a very cool set of developments, a moribund form of Proto-Northwest Semitic narration, the short yaqtul, perfective, was frozen down and preserved in a cryofreeze by this conjunction wa in biblical Hebrew. And we have similar things in certain other Northwest Semitic languages, but biblical Hebrew is the language from which we know this process best. And after biblical times, this, so to speak, compound tense dies out, basically. Even in late biblical Hebrew, you don't find it as much. And in Mishnaic Hebrew, it's basically dead, except in biblical quotations. Okay, so that's the banal bit. Well, banal in the sense that this is stuff that Semitists generally know and agree on. The bit that is a little more speculative is I'd like to mention something here from a totally different linguistic phylum, namely Tocharian. Tocharian is the name of an Indo-European branch. That is a branch of the same linguistic family to which English belongs, and my native language, Swedish, by the way, and lots of other languages from Europe and the Indian subcontinent, and, well, nowadays all over the world, since the Indo-European languages have expanded so far. The Tocharian languages, which today are utterly extinct, were spoken in Xinjiang in Western China, and there were two of them. They're sometimes called Tocharian A and Tocharian B, or East Tocharian and West Tocharian, or Agnian and Kuchian. Well, the reason I'm mentioning them is because in an article of mine, I use certain developments from Tocharian to provide a sort of side view on how the imperfect consecutive of biblical Hebrew may have come to be. I argue there that the setting for the deep freezer effect of the wa that created the waihi and yaqtul and all the others, the imperfect consecutives, that this came from a specific social setting, namely the setting of sitting down and telling, well, you don't necessarily have to sit, but anyway, telling a traditional story. That this specific context of sitting down telling a traditional narration would have created the impetus for this deep freezer verbal form being both preserved and created at the same time. That is, that you can argue that the creation of this verbal form, the grammaticalization thereof, is dependent on a specific social setting, that of telling a traditional narrative. And the reason Tocharian comes into this is I use a parallel, a typological parallel, mind you, from Tocharian to show that this is the sort of thing that happens. And this is from East Tocharian. East Tocharian has two words for I. That is, it has two first-person singular pronouns, one masculine and one feminine. So there's one masculine I and one feminine I. The masculine one is called nish, and the feminine one is called nyuk. Nish and nyuk. And this is very, very rare in the Indo-European family. It's quite rare generally. There are languages that do use masculine and feminine coding in choosing pronouns. Japanese is an example where pronouns like ore are very masculinely coded, and atashi is coded to be very feminine, and there are other examples. But in East Tocharian, it wasn't just a tendency, it was a grammatical difference, and this occurs nowhere else in the Indo-European family. The Semitic languages tend to differ in the second person and the third between masculine and feminine, but not even there do you find a difference in the first person. And especially in the Indo-European languages, it's basically a totally isolated thing. Not even West Tocharian has this. And of course, there has been an immense set of discussions on how this came to be out of a system that had nothing like that. Proto-Indo-European had nothing like that. Not even Proto-Tocharian seems to have had anything of the sort. And the best solution, I think, was argued by Jay Jasanoff, who wrote an article in which he argues that both of these pronouns in East Tocharian, nish and nyuk, go back to different forms of the old Proto-Indo-European word for I, nominative ego, and accusative me. Well, he might have reconstructed them a bit differently, but those two. And the actual historical developments leading to nish versus nyuk are complex, and I won't go into them here exactly, but his argument was that women would have used the nominative, whereas men would have started using the accusative for the nominative as well, in a way similar to what you find in French, for example, using moi, which is originally an accusative, often for the nominative as well, or stuff in English like it's me instead of it is I. And the argument he made is that the women would have been more conservative or and quote unquote correct in their speech than the men, which is why women would have kept using the nominative, which you can see by the K at the end, njuk, which is the same velar sound which you find at the end of eg or in the middle of ego, whereas the men would have used the accusative. And that this, which was originally a difference in saying it's me or it's I, that this would have been so coded according to gender among the pre-East Tocharian speaker base members that after a while, this social difference switched from just being social preference to being actual linguistic grammaticalized coding for one of the forms, the old accusative, nish being I man, and the old nominative, njuk being I woman. That is a social difference, originally a social difference in speech, being encoded as a grammatical one. And that's what I use as a parallel for the development of the wow consecutive, the yaqtul, the consecutive imperfect, the and he killed or and she killed or whatever of biblical Hebrew, i.e., a situation in which what was originally a socially coded development turned into a grammaticalized one. There are many other examples of this in the world, but I use the Tocharian example of the first person pronoun as a typological parallel for how this might have happened. That first you had a choice of form that was based on social setting, gender, as in not as in originally in grammatical gender, but as a social gender in the Tocharian case, which then turned into grammatical gender, and the setting of story narration in the early Hebrew case. So, to sum up, the Hebrew consecutive imperfect is a cool beast. It's simultaneously very, very archaic and very, very innovative. And it's circumscribed but extremely powerful, providing a way for continuous narration. And one of the coolest uses of this form, I think, you can find already in the first verses of the Hebrew Bible in Genesis chapter 1, in which the first line, Bereshith bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, is in the perfect. It is the case that in the beginning God created heaven and earth, or if you want to choose another interpretation, in the beginning of the fact that God created heaven and earth. So there it's a statement of fact, that yes, God has created heaven and earth. But then in verse 3, when stuff starts happening, when God actually starts doing something, when it's no longer background info, it switches to the imperfect consecutive. Vayomer Elohim yehi or vayhi or. And God said that let there be light, and there was light. So that verse 3 signals the switch from background info to narration, with the switch from, amongst other things, the perfect to the imperfect consecutive, switching to the narrative form. And another very cool thing about that switch is the fact that the first thing he says is yehi, may there be, which is a jussive. That is the old short yaqtul used for commands. May there be light, or exhortations. Yehi or, may there be light. Wayhi or, and there was light. Wayhi is the imperfect consecutive, which is based on the old short yaqtul form. Wayhi, based on yehi, which is a sort of pun you can only do within the Hebrew verbal system, because Hebrew has this relationship between the two descendants of the short yaqtul, that is the jussive, which is used for exhortations, may there be light, and the narrative form, the imperfect consecutive, wayhi, and there was light. And here the priestly author of Genesis 1 makes good use of the fact that these forms are so similar in how they look and indeed in their history. So there the genesis, pardon the pun, of these forms is used for creative wordplay by the priestly author. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. Vayomer Elohim yehi or, wayhi or. And remember, the texts we know as the Hebrew Bible, including Genesis 1, read best, as we just saw, in their original language.